So we have subtracted the baseline for this XRD sample that we have, and we're ready to start analyzing the peaks. So you see these peaks here, and what we want to get out of this curve fitting session is where they're located so that I have a 2 theta value. This could then be used to calculate the d-spacings of the planes and the lattice parameter ultimately. So we really want to know that. But we also, for different types of processes, we would want to know how high they are, what the intensity is of each of the peaks, and therefore the relative intensity of the various peaks. And then we also, in a lot of tasks that we do, want to know how wide the peaks are as well. And so we'll show you how to get something called the full width half max, or FWHM. So all of these can be done from this curve fitting software, Fityk. All right, so let's start. So to start, we have to kind of guess where the peaks are, and then we're going to let the algorithms in the program do the hard part of fitting the peaks for us. So this is very easy for Fityk. What we're going to do is all the buttons that we want to sort of use are up here. And so we're going to go to what we call add peak mode. So that makes it very easy. And then if you look over here, there's an auto add. So if I hit this, chances are the biggest peak that we see, we're going to see this thing appear, right? And so that's good. So it has sort of auto found what it thinks a peak is. So then if we keep hitting it, it'll kind of go through the list of the lesser peaks that we see. And so again, the second one showed up here. If I do it again, this one shows up. If I do it again, you see this one shows up. And again, you'll actually notice that this one went back. So if I go back to this zoom mode, you'll see that it really looks like there's 2 peaks, right? We kind of scanned through and saw that. So that's a good heads up to know that that's going to happen. So let's go back to the add peak mode, auto add again, and you'll see again another one showed up here. So we're fitting 2 there. If I hit it again, it looks like it's added a second one here. And again, let's go back and see if that makes sense. Yeah, so it looks like there maybe is a little asymmetry, and so maybe there's a second peak. All right, let's go back to add peak mode and zoom out, and then hit it again. Okay, so there, I was looking for it to add these last couple peaks out there. Oh, it added this one. That looks like a little peak as well. And then, yeah, there's that. I'm kind of looking for that last one. So really anything above the baseline is what we're looking for. This area right here. Let me zoom into this. So if you'll see there, I actually added something. Ignore that for a second. I'll come back and talk about that. But I'm going to go back to the zoom mode and then zoom in on that. So you'll see that maybe something's there. It's a little bit above what we would call the background. So this is kind of the background noise. It looks like something's a little tall. So there's not much of a peak there, but we could add it if we want. And so that's kind of a discretion call. Chances are, if it's this low, the peak position can be slightly off. And so if that happens, we often have to run the scan again so that we get more signal here. So for now, I'll ignore this peak if it is a peak. It's very small. Okay, so let me zoom back out so you can see the whole thing. So we've got all these peaks located, but I do want to go in and just look at one more thing really quick, a different way that we can add it. So if we don't like one of the peaks that it added, if you go there and you see that the cross came up on it. So if you scroll over and you see that cross, you can right click and you can delete it. So if it added something that you didn't like, you can do that. If I go back to the auto add, it should come back, right? So let me delete that one. So let's say that it didn't add one that you really think is a peak. So like this one. So we can auto add, but we can also manually add. So that's what this add peak mode is all about. So if I click and hold, you'll see that, and I'm basically, if I go, I'm still holding down the left arrow key, or sorry, the left mouse button. And if I move up, it makes a triangle that's larger. And if I sort of go side to side, I can make the triangle, the base larger. And so I can adjust that by moving left to right. So if I want to, so I can manually add a peak that way, right? So you saw that clicking and holding and moving up or left to right allowed me to add a peak. And it does it in the shape that I think it is, right? So you can manually add a peak by using that mode, by being in this add mode and then clicking, holding, and then adjusting the size of that peak by going up to increase the height or left to right. So there is a margin of error. You don't have to have it perfect, because the fitting process is going to fine tune the size of these peaks. So you can just get in the ballpark of the shape of that peak, and then the software is going to do it for us. All right. So I've added all the peaks that I've wanted to add. So we've got a couple here, this one, a couple here, and so forth. So let's say that we're satisfied with the number of peaks. So the process isn't done. This is just adding the peaks to roughly where we think they should be. What we want to do now is actually go to the fitting process. So before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the different types of curve fitting options that we have. So if you click up here where it says pseudo void, you'll see that there's a lot of options. There's a lot of different types of curves that we can fit with this software. So you may be familiar with Gaussian. That's a common one. You see some other options. But it turns out that the signal for X-ray diffraction fits very well to this pseudo-void type of curve shape. So this basically tells us about the curve shape. So that's why I'm going to have pseudo-void. If it starts out somewhere else, you want to make sure that when you fit these curves that you've got it under pseudo-void. So that, even though I did it slightly out of order, make sure that this is selected before you start adding peaks. Okay, so we've got all the peaks that we want. We have it under pseudo-void. We've already gone through the background or the baseline subtraction. So now what's left is we want to fit these curves. So we've kind of given it basic parameters. Again, if I zoom in, I can see that I'm saying that there's roughly a peak here, and all through it, that's what it looks like. But what I'm going to do is allow the fitting process to happen. So you'll see that there's an option up here that if I hold up over it long enough, it says start fitting, right? So what this is going to do is take our basic parameters and try to fit the curve with those peaks that we have, and it's going to try to minimize the difference between the peaks that we've selected, the resulting curves from those. So essentially these red peaks are individual diffraction peaks, and then the cumulative curve is the yellow, right? And so it is trying to minimize the error between the curve, the fitted curve, which is the total, is the yellow. So it's the sum of all the red curves. And it wants to minimize the difference between that and the experimental data, which in this case is the green dots, right? So we're trying to minimize that error. So let me go back out. And if I hit the start fitting button, it should try to fit this as best as it can, matching the yellow to the green. All right. So it looks like it's done. It doesn't look like, sometimes it may not look like it did anything, but let's go back and zoom in on those peaks. So yeah, so it was hard to tell, but there is a little difference in those peaks. Let's zoom in to a different area. Yeah, so again, it's trying to match these as close as possible. There we go. Oh, missed it. So yeah, it's trying to match the yellow to the green as close as possible. It's trying to match our experimental with our predicted curve fit. And so that's what we've done here. And so this is example how we do this. One thing that I will mention as I was looking through this, I noticed if you go to that kind of second set of peaks that we have. All right, so that was the first one. And if we keep going to this next one, you'll notice that we only have one peak here, and the fit seems to be slightly off. It's pretty minor, but it looks slightly off. And so one thing you'll notice in X-ray diffraction is when we have these examples of peaks really close together, like this, and it happens in each set, right? You saw that here we had two, here we had two, here we had two, here we had two. If we have that kind of two peaks together, this is an example of peak splitting. And if that happens everywhere else, it should happen here. So us not having a second peak here is probably a mistake. And so let me go in and add a second one. And I'll just kind of guess it, right? So again, here you see it, once I added that second one, it made the peak look a little different, but I can go back and refit, and you can see that it's adjusted now, right? So now it's got a much better fit between the experimental and the expected curve fit, right? The yellow and the green match up really well. So that's good. And so again, this is something particular about XRD. If you see those peaks really close together, like you see here, all of the peaks are going to end up having that phenomenon. All right. So another way that we can sort of visually indicate whether we have a good fit or not is down here in this derivative mode. So this is actually the derivative of the curve, what you see down here. And once you add peaks through the fitting process, you'll hopefully see that the peaks down here get smaller and smaller. So the closer this is to background means that the difference between those two curves is getting less and less. So this is good that there's only these little spikes here at each case, right? If these were huge, that would mean the difference between our peak fitting and the experimental data is a lot bigger. The difference is a lot bigger. So we want that to be as small as possible. So this is good. So you might go back and look at it, what it looked like before. So this is, this is how we do the peak fitting process. Again, very easy using this software, using pseudo-void. If you use another like Gaussian, you'll see that the peak fits aren't quite as good because they don't match the shape as well as pseudo-void. All right, so we've got these peaks fitted, but for us, when we're doing our analysis on, trying to index these curves or these XRD patterns, we need the values, right? We need to know what the peak location is and everything. So if I go over here to the right panels, you'll see that right now I'm on data. But if I go to function, you'll see that I have the actual useful data that I need. So they're numbered. So these are, you might see that they're kind of out of order in terms of the centers because they're in the way that we added the peaks. So they're a little bit out of order. But then it also mentions, this first thing is the background, and then these are the various curves. So you can see that it should say pseudo-void. That's the type of curve we have. And then the center is where the location is. So where the location, so you can see that this, if we do this, it should highlight it. So it's this first curve is at 43.6279, and that's degrees to theta. So that's where that is located. If we zoom in, then that should match pretty well with the value for that peak. And it's highlighted, and so that thing kind of highlights there. And so these are all the peaks that we have. You can also right click and add different amounts too. So you can see the area of the curve, you can see the height of the curve, and then this last one, this full width half max. So this is also important as well. The full width half max is a very apt description of it. It is the width of a peak at half the maximum. So the maximum value is up here, so around 1200. So if you go to about 600 and look at the width of that peak, that is what the full width half max is. So what it's telling us is that the width at half the maximum is 0.14 or 15 degrees, right? So that tells us about how wide these curves are, and it'll do that for all of them. So we have a lot of information about the various peaks. So we have it in this table that we could copy. We can also go to export, and we can do export peak parameters, and it'll come up as a .peaks file, and so you can save it as this. And then if we go to if we go back to the file here, we see that we have an ss.peaks. This is our peak fitting information. And then if I open it, it doesn't really know what to do with that, but it's really just a text file. So if you open it with a Word text reading file, so let me go ahead and do that real quick. So if I just open it with like text editor or something like that, then it should give us, and it opened on the wrong desktop. Let's bring that in view. You'll see that we have all that information to us. So we have the peak number, the type of peak, and then the center, height, area, full width half max, and then some other parameters. So this is how we can get this. So if you've looked at some of the CSV files and so forth, we have some of this information that we used, that we did with traces, but we can get the same information with this peak fitting software that you have access to on your home computer. All right, so that's how we get peak information using this curve fitting software known as Fityk.